Hello and welcome to our first live event of our new online series, The History Effect, produced by the History Council of New South Wales. I'm Dr. Stephen Gapps and I'll be facilitating this session today. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners and custodians of the land, and the nearby waters of Sydney Harbour where the History Council office is located. And I pay my respects to elders both past and present. The 26th of May is an important day within Reconciliation Week. It is National Sorry Day, which remembers and acknowledges the mistreatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who were forcibly removed from their families and communities, which we now know as the Stolen Generations. The 26th of May 2020 is also the third anniversary of the signing of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, a constitutional convention that brought together over 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders to Uluru on the lands of the Anangu people. Their intention was to discuss and agree on an approach to constitutional reform to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So, what has the progress on this reform been over the last 3 years? On behalf of the History Council of New South Wales, we're very honoured to have with us today two amazing women in discussion about the Uluru Statement. Megan Davis, Professor of Law at the University of New South Wales, will be interviewed by Heidi Norman, Professor of Social and Political Sciences at UTS. Professor Davis is a Cobble Aboriginal woman from southeast Queensland, and Professor Norman is a Gomeroi woman from northwestern New South Wales. So now I'm going to pass you across to Professor Heidi Norman.
I thought it might be useful to provide just a very brief introduction and a bit of an overview about the circumstances that led up, to provide some context about what the Uluru Statement from the Heart is about, and the sort of historical trajectory, I guess, of this moment, that came about, amazing moment that came about 3 years ago, and that Megan Davis was so pivotal too. She worked around the clock on that, and she was incredibly generous with her time and led this really significant moment in Australian history. So just by way of context, I guess, it's worth thinking about that the modern nations constituted a federation in 1901, and what we know is that Aboriginal people, for a period of nearly 70 years, until the 1967 referendum, were excluded from the life of the nation. And since that referendum, so since 1967, policy debates have variously considered how to recognise Aboriginal people within the framework of the nation state. And tracking alongside these policy debates has been the call for recognition of Aboriginal law and land, and for sovereignty, expressed as a call for a treaty or treaties. And this call has been repeated for generations and with growing clarity from 1972. Since 2010, Australian governments have committed to some form of process to recognise or acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution. The sustaining argument by Aboriginal peoples is that Aboriginal polity has neither a clear nor a just relationship to Australian political institutions. What was missing from the many reports, inquiries and consultations was the views of First Peoples about the way forward. And to this end, gatherings were convened by the Referendum Council that Megan Davis was so much a part of, were convened in each state and territory. And in my experience, having attended one of those, one of the New South Wales sessions, it quickly emerged that what was being sought was more than symbols, and an appetite for deep thinking that combined political strategy and vision for more substantial recognition within the life of the nation was starting to take form. Delegates from these state and territory forums gathered on the lands of the Anangu people, as Stephen has told us. And after 4 days of yarning and debate, the central ideas were crafted in what became a powerful piece of oratory, imbued with the significance of place. The Uluru Statement outlined 3 central reforms: voice, treaty, truth. A First Nations voice to be enshrined in the Constitution, a Makarrata Commission which could set up legislation and shape agreement making, and truth-telling about our history. For many, these priorities came as a surprise departure from the reforms that had been under consideration for close to a decade. So let's start with some questions, and I'd like us to start with some personal reflections, Megan. In that essay in the Griffith Review, you say that Uluru was something else. And in these words, I hear your unswerving enthusiasm that I think has really been central to keeping the demands of the Uluru Statement alive. And I also hear some wistfulness or melancholy. Why was this statement from the heart something else?
The whole, I think, process, or the whole 3 years post Uluru is a little bit of both of those emotions, I think. I think at the time when I was referring to Uluru being something else, is that in some ways the work that had been done in the dialogues was done in a way that we were, acutely conscious of the ways in which the state had ignored or rejected previous attempts at addressing unfinished business. One of the key things we wanted to, so we knew, we know from history, we knew that Turnbull would say no. We knew that it would take people a while to understand what it was that we had determined, particularly the political elite that had become wedded to this notion of symbolism, that it didn't really matter what form of recognition it was. It just mattered that the 2 major political parties agreed, and it didn't really matter what Aboriginal people thought. And I think in the dialogues we did have that conversation, and the broader leadership and the Referendum Council, at least Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members, had thought that, the only way that we could probably push forward on this kind of reform, and it's a big kind of nation building thing that you're trying to retrofit, so far away from the dispossession, was that we ran a very informed, deliberative process that involved legal education, civics education. So we walked people through the legal reforms, but as you said, we ensured there was political strategy in those conversations too. For example, the expert panel came out with a non-discrimination clause, knowing full well that it was going to be rejected. So we had those conversations in the dialogues about what we thought might fly politically. We didn't want that to lead the conversation, though. It came much later in 3 days. So we had to talk about political reality and as the kinds of traditions that Australia clings to in terms of legal and political institutions, and whether this was the time that we could ignore them or whether we could accommodate them. And so I think that the key thing about the Uluru Statement was the invitation to the Australian people. So what everybody accepted was the limitations of Australian retail politics, that the 2 major parties and the way in which Western Liberal democratic governance functions today probably a lot worse than 3 years ago, was that this could only be done if we engaged the Australian people to help us to do it, given that we took very, very seriously the words in the Constitution that say that the text of the Constitution can only be changed by the Australian people. And to do this work, you have to take that seriously. And we know the history of Australia is such that only 8 out of 44 attempts have succeeded since 1901, meaning politicians don't like referendums because they feel they're more likely to lose. And that's certainly fed Malcolm Turnbull's rejection, in that he is a prime minister who is alive with experience of only knowing how to lose a referendum, not win one. So the text is changeable, and we are all Australians who can change that text, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. So we took that seriously. And so that, I suppose, informs that statement. Australia was something. Uluru was something else. Because one thing that's very rarely conveyed through the media, or the media has almost zero interest in, is the overwhelming interest we have had from Australians, ordinary Australians, about the Uluru Statement and about pushing this reform forward. And I don't want to be a Pollyanna about that, because, of course, if it was the case that it looked dead in the water, I think many people would walk away, Pat, Noel. But the polling has been remarkably consistent since 2017. And this year's polling that we've got Crosby Textor to do shows, again, very solid 60%. Earlier this year, it was sat between 60 and 70%. And last year, some of the polls from ANU and Griffith Uni, again, showed these very strong support between 60 and 70% for a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. And so Uluru is something else, because even though the political elite are very slow to the party, and they're slow to understanding who the dialogues were and what they wanted, there just seemed to have been something intuitive in that many Australians have got. Anyway, I think that was what I was referring to when I said Uluru is something else.
Okay, so you've mentioned the strategic thinking, not as a driving force, but as a deep consideration in this process. And then the other point you raised was the enduring public support. So let's just, before we come back to those points, why, in thinking about a voice, which is one of the three and quite possibly a kind of top order priority, if we think about the voice to Parliament, not in Parliament, but a voice to Parliament, what do you think are the strategic objectives that informed that aspiration? And what are the kind of material benefits that having a voice to Parliament might bring about?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a big question, because although the reform had been on the table for a long time, the fact that it was prioritised as the number one reform option in all communities was interesting. So I think if I can just deal with the material benefits first, but I can come back to that. I mean, really, it's about better quality laws and policies that will improve decision-making in Australian parliaments, in Australian bureaucracies about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So most Aussies accept, I think, in coming on board with the Uluru Statement, that Australia does a very, very poor job in this area. And that's demonstrated in all of the evidence that shows this country and its bureaucrats and its politicians are incapable of closing the gap. I don't think that anyone can argue with that. And I think this kind of pragmatic idea that when you design policies and you design laws, that you come and talk to the communities that are affected, it's a kind of intuitive thing people understand. And the one thing I think a lot of people don't understand is just how suffocated communities are by bureaucrats, and just how little autonomy people often have about the money that is coming into their communities. So I think in terms of the legal and political strategy and the talk or conversation about the voice to Parliament, and I reflect on this because I think that a lot of people thought that the reform would be to the race power, because that had consumed the bulk of the kind of national conversation, or at least in Indigenous affairs, insofar as constitutional recognition prior. But there'd been a really dramatic shift that at least hasn't been well explained, or at least to politicians, as to why the expert panel reforms look very different from the referendum council reforms. And that is two big issues. So one of the biggest issues with this political strategy was simply people felt a non-discrimination clause, which did rank second. Well, it depends on which dialogue, but it was roughly the same kind of support as treaty, would just simply take too long. The point being that the way governments passed or parliaments pass laws are such that on the other side of that law, if it happens to be discriminatory laws or a discriminatory law, you need to litigate, and litigation requires money and strategy and time and energy. And in one of the dialogues in Far North Queensland, actually, I remember one of the TOs from one of the PBCs up there saying that, and that's the Native Title Holding Group, saying that they had to endure the discriminatory Commonwealth employment program in their region, and they wanted to challenge it under the Racial Discrimination Act, and that when they communicated with a barrister in Brisbane about how much it would cost to challenge this in the High Court, the bill was too high for them. So there's an economic issue when it comes to reliance on rights enshrined in constitutions, even if you were to get that. The other thing that was really palpable across the Federation and across the regions in terms of our people was the fatigue with courts. So native title has just pushed people to the edge in terms of having to manage Western courts and the way in which courts do their business and the way in which the Australian legal system does its business. So there was very little appetite for a court-based solution at that point. And so I think the notion of the voice to Parliament was very attractive because it's an upfront political empowerment of our people. And we can talk about what that structure looks later. The last point I'd just simply make is that between the expert panel and the referendum council, you'd had a policy implemented by the new Abbott government called the Indigenous Advancement Strategy. And it's an interesting policy. There's 2 Australian National Audit Office reports on it. And this policy, when it was first implemented, wreaked havoc in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, because when the Abbott government came in, they took a razor to virtually all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programs and policies and just cut everybody's money without telling them. Well, they told you, but there was no opportunity to challenge that and get that reviewed. So effectively, the IAS is a policy where you take all of the black money across the Commonwealth and you put it into one bucket. So the Indigenous Law Bulletin, for example, at the Indigenous Law Centre, it had been published and funded by Attorney Generals for like 20 years, I think, or 30 years. They just cut it, and then you had to apply from this bucket of money to get any money back. And what had happened was, and I remember talking to the minister, he wasn't a minister at the time, Ken Wyatt, at one of the recognition Joint Select Committee events, is that they had actually just cut without considering what the programs were. So that's why really successful things like the Women's Night Patrols and so many successful programs were cut, including some programs that were the very early legacy of the Whitlam self-determination era. So there was an effective dismantling of the Aboriginal domain. And so when communities applied to get that money back from that bucket, most people hear me, Heidi, okay? Because my computer is saying my internet is unstable. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, it's still okay. Yeah, keep going. It's okay.
So just to finish that point, the bulk of the money, the black money, went to corporations with RAPs, to the NGO not-for-profit sector. So, you know, if I reflect on Yarrabah, 40 minutes out of Cairns, for example, they lost programs they'd run for years, and they were now run by Save the Children, who would drive in from Cairns. And so you'd have non-Indigenous organisations now going into communities and delivering programs that they once ran. So all of this meant that when we got out to communities to talk about constitutional recognition, there wasn't a huge appetite to talk about that on the first day, because so many communities had been absolutely devastated by the IAS. And I think the IAS had a huge influence in the way people saw the law reforms when we said to you or to them, what is meaningful recognition to you? What would constitutional recognition, what form of it, you know, do you seek? And the voice was the bulk of the dialogues chose.
Yeah. So it seems that when we did have a representative body in place that was really demolished around about 2004, there was an attempt at an Aboriginal order of government. And since that time, there's been such a loss of foothold in shaping and having a say over the kind of policies and programs and allocation of funding. And I think, you know, what you mapped out there was just the absolute crisis in, you know, the Aboriginal affairs policy making. And a real loss of confidence in how the interest government has in hearing Aboriginal voices and in self-determination. So that takes me to the next point, and we've got a couple more to go after this, and that is how change happens. And if we look at some of those early examples of key sort of you know, moments of mobilisation, quite often those they are petitions to either the Crown, in the case of, say, the 1972 Larrakia petition, or even by 1988 to the Prime Minister in the case of the Gurunga Statement. The Uluru Statement from the Heart was, in my calculation, a very, if not the only moment where this key moment of mobilisation has not been delivered to the formal institutions of power, to government or other representatives. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
So it's a good question, because I've reflected on this, and it was very deliberate though. What I'm trying to say is that very early on in the dialogue, before we even got to the civics education, the kind of deliberative process, was that we traversed the kind of trajectory of Aboriginal advocacy for recognition since as long as we could remember. So we mapped it out at least from 1901, a bit before that though, around Aboriginal calls for structural reform. So we looked at many. We looked at calls for reserved seats and designated parliamentary seats. We looked at vague proposals by elders and others for some kind of voice to Parliament. We looked at treaties and agreements. We looked at the many ways in which our people have conceived of structural reform, or what we called recognition. So that early part was simply to try and not reclaim the word recognition, but recognition obviously is a formal technical word in law and politics. And it became too synonymous with recognise, and we can discuss that later, but what it meant was we had to work hard to say to people, look, just think of recognition as this technical term about about structural reform. But in that, and in providing that history, and it ended up being like this 30-minute DVD that I'd written and Rachel Perkins produced. We'd get to the end, and then we would have these conversations about the marvellous ritualism of blackfellas petitioning the Crown and petitioning prime ministers, and then reflect on what came after. And I think there became this kind of consensus view that we didn't want to go to Uluru and hand over something beautiful to the powers that be, who then go to Canberra and hang it on the wall. And we just become a part of this ritualistic history of Australia where, we play our part, we dance our ceremonies and sing our songs, we hand over a reform that our people have taken, years and years to think about, to have telephone conversations 24/7 for like 3 to 5 years about law and strategy and all of the, the pain and all of the effort that our people put into thinking carefully about how to come up with a form of recognition that will align with Australians' ideas of who they are and what their institutions are. And then you usually get the kind of no response from the Prime Minister not long after, because they will do some calculation about where they are in the electoral cycle, or they'll do polling and they'll see that it doesn't come up in the top 10 issues that the focus groups are talking about, and therefore it's not worth pursuing. So there was a decision made at Yulara to uninvite the politicians who, we'd had conversations with Shorten and Turnbull, etc. And we decided we'd issue it to the Australian people instead.
Yeah.
And that was the theory behind the Uluru Statement, was that we would need to mobilise Australians first to get them to help us put the pressure on those political parties who, just suffer great inertia, sometimes cowardice, I guess, in some cases, when it comes to big picture issues in this country. So yeah, it was absolutely a departure from our previous history.
Yeah. Another key theme that emerged from the Uluru Statement was truth-telling about our history. And I think one of the curious things was that in all of the reports that had gone on since 2010, the inquiries, the consultations, truth-telling about our history was raised in all of the referendum council reports, most of those at least, and it was a leading aspiration that was captured in the Uluru Statement. So this was quite a point of departure from all of those government-led inquiries and reports. And it's really worth, I think, thinking about in some detail. So truth-telling, I hear that a lot from people in government in other ways, and it is starting to sound a bit sloganistic. But if we think about this carefully, what do you think truth-telling about our history, why do you think it emerged as such a priority out of those forums, out of the dialogues?
I think it's a really good question, because people have completely misread, in my view, what the dialogues were talking about in terms of truth-telling and Australian history. And it's been interesting to see, for us not to interrupt that national kind of discourse around the truth-telling, but to see, one of the first things people, National Congress did this, immediately calling for a Truth Commission or Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That notion that somehow some institutional framework like that is going to be the thing that can deliver the nation to the kind of truth-telling that I think the dialogues were alluding to. But no one had spoken about setting up a big truth, and I just don't think that necessarily fits with the temperament of our people. I don't think they meant it in a carrot and stick way. Not that is what truth-telling is a really complicated process. So let me try and answer that question, because I think one of the things that I think mob were acutely aware of is that reconciliation, the process, is off the rails. And that's partly because Well, two reasons. The reconciliation process isn't really predicated upon any pursuit of truth or justice. And I think that was confirmed for a lot of us when we saw the Cabinet papers released. And you can see on Trove the kind of Cabinet discussions they have when they decide to set up the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation. So you're setting up a statutory framework for reconciliation because you can't deliver on your promise for a treaty, or you can't deliver on national land rights. So the very basis of the Australian notion of truth and justice, reconciliation, really didn't start from the position that it probably should. So in some ways it was a political compromise. And then in 2000, you had John Howard accept the roadmap to reconciliation and reject it all. Then he creates this really fabulous dichotomy, well, I don't mean fabulous, but binary, reconciliation binary. He says there's two kinds of reconciliation. There's practical reconciliation and symbolic. So anything constitutional, hard-headed, legal, structural reform is now symbolic and wishy-washy, and anything that's to do with their government policies of assimilation are now practical reconciliation. And I think that's one of my colleagues who I teach with actually is on, I can see he's on the line. We were talking about this yesterday in preparing our class for next week. I think Howard was very successful in creating that and consolidating that binary, but that's a whole other question. So Reconciliation Australia, reconciliation process, really, really severely criticised in the dialogues, right, as a process. And people feel really disconnected from it and really let down that, they'd endorsed the recognised process, which was in many communities' views, propagating a notion of symbolic recognition. So, at this point, 2015, 2016, so we did all the trial leadership dialogues in 2016, and started in Hobart late 2016 and then ran it in 2017. You have people with zero appetite for symbolism, right? They will not come to the party on symbolism. They want hard-headed reform and they want Australians to support it because you owe us that much was, the kind of... But before you could get there, they reflected on reconciliation, where we are, truth and justice, and Australian history just became the driving conversation. And so much so that after some of the trial dialogues, we thought we needed to kind of fit in an extra day to allow people to talk about truth-telling. They didn't necessarily call it truth-telling. They spoke about issues that when you got to the end of the day and we did our kind of report back sessions, it was about Australian history and how it's taught in primary schools. How is it taught? What is taught? People would talk about local sacred sites, and them having control over whether, that goes on, an historian's database or not, that they have the choice as to whether they want to share their history with Australians or not. There was stories about the statues and a lot of conversations about the statues of explorers. There was a very earnest, I thought, and it's very emotional to reflect on it, but a lot of the old people really just earnestly asking the question, and I've said this before in speeches, but don't Australians want to know who we are? There was a really palpable sense of just feeling completely excluded from the Australian story. And that's partly why, I often say to people, the Uluru Statement is the full 18 pages. It's not just the front argument, the kind of quick articulation of this reform. It's the reforms and the reasons why we chose them. And then there's our story. And so part of that our story that is in the Uluru Statement was us going through all of the records, all of the Butcher's papers and pulling out the stories that each of the regions talked about and putting it into some sort of coherent framework that showed, a mirror back to Australia and say, look, this is the Aboriginal history of Australia. These are the things that happen to us. This is how we see our history. So, we would talk about the frontier massacres, obviously. In some of the dialogues, especially I think in Broome, you had some people who had still been witness to some killings. The frontier, the killings were very real and present in people's minds. And also it's fair to say, and certainly our story says this, that as a collective Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, we are choosing to call this a genocide from now on. We're not going to play around with the academic arguments over this word, in the same as we chose to just say from now on we are calling it an invasion, and all of that is embedded in our story. But there was just a very kind of palpable sadness that this story of ours that we carry very deeply in us as people is not known by so many Australians. How can it not be? And I think one of the most beautiful things in, say, former Chief Judge Murray Gleeson's wonderful articulation of why you need a voice to Parliament is simply that the entire development of this nation was built on the basis of dispossession. And I think Brennan says it in Mabo, you know, the dispossession underwrote the development of the nation. This is a really core issue. This is a fact. This is a fact of this nation. And there was just a deep sadness that we don't want to talk about it. And then we would go through this, then people would just follow us, they would just walk us through the stages. Then we would move on to protection and the many just awful stories of people in compulsory racial segregation, you know, the burning of towns and people being locked behind barbed wire, just that protection, you know, we still benignly call it the protection era in Australia. Just this very brutal period, and so many aunties and so many people in the dialogues that had lived in that time. And then moving on to the assimilation period and the stolen generations. And yeah, so I felt a few things that came from that. One, Australian history and truth-telling, we use the language of truth-telling, is really important here. And it's not necessarily, a lot of people will say to me, oh, Megan, you know, Aussies got to learn their history and then you can have your voice. I can see that my screen is frozen.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
But I'll just keep talking.
Yeah.
But I don't think it works that way. So what we did here was that people felt there was a lot of history telling going on through the native title process and the land rights processes. What I got the sense was that, and this is partly why the Makarrata Commission's function would be to facilitate truth-telling, and that is people want truth-telling, but they want it done at a local level in a way that they can control the pace and the information. And they will share stories when they're ready to share stories, and then there are some stories they can never share. It was a very sophisticated conversation, I would say, in the dialogues, and certainly not well represented once it hit the mainstream discourse, because, as you say, it's picked up now by politicians and others, and it's a kind of slogan that's starting to be stripped of any meaning. And the Uluru Statement, and in its entirety and its reforms, is a form of truth-telling to the nation.
Yeah, I think I think you have said and others have said that it's a roadmap, a call for peace, and with it a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood, which is an incredibly generous and optimistic way to think about the possibility of truth-telling about our history. But and it's certainly there's a big job there and a big challenge for historians to become much more involved in these ideas about nationhood and you know, the policy and legal dimensions of nationhood. So that would certainly be a challenge that I would make to historians, to be thinking very carefully and critically in this space.
I agree, and this has been my thing, and I hope you can still hear me, Heidi, since Uluru. Okay. The role of historians here. And I've gone to a couple of history conferences on this, but historians need to really step up to the plate here, I think. I thought in many ways, in the same ways that you bring in lawyers for structural reform, this was a call from the dialogues to Australian historians to do their part here. And what that means is the subject of further conversations, I think. but I think there's a bit of heavy lifting, and I've spoken vaguely to, I think at UNSW, I think Grace Karskens is a colleague, and there's a few historians I've spoken to about this, but I'm not quite sure. I went to that Irish Australian Historians Conference in Dublin, and I raised this issue because when it came up, and a few historians responded in an interesting way. I was kind of like, where are you guys in this space? And then it was kind of like, well, we've got our own work to do, and do we really have permission to go into this space? And it was kind of this kind of disinterested, hands-off, and this is, I'm not criticizing anyone in particular, but that part of the Uluru Statement, it is an Australian historian's document, a working document. I've just been really interested in, not everyone's been like it, but there's been a huge kind of disengagement, or not disengagement, just disinterest, I think. Well, that might not even be fair. I don't even know the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, I just saw a post there from Kira proposing a decolonisation of Australian history. So maybe that's an area that historians can pick up. I'm mindful of the time.
So Heidi, can I say, yeah, I agree, and those conversations are going on, but there is a role for historians to play in legal reform.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Now.
Yep.
Sorry.
Good point. So where to now? This is our sort of wrap-up question, and we'll open it up for broader questions from our 30 or so participants. In July 2009, I'm not sure if you were there, but at the National Press Club, Kem Wyatt, who's the first Aboriginal man who is the Indigenous Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, the Federal Indigenous Affairs Minister, I should say, he spoke with enormous confidence, saying that he would advance a referendum on constitutional change for Indigenous constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians within the current parliamentary term. Within days, he was slapped down by his coalition colleagues, and it was very apparent that that he didn't have support within the government for progressing a referendum. So where do you think we're up to in advancing the aspirations for voice, treaty and truth? And we might think about that in terms of the current crisis, so what will amount to what is already and what will continue to be a very significant economic disruption, and how these debates might be shaped in light of that economic disruption.
So, obviously we listen very closely to all of Ken's ministerial pronouncements. I mean, the only thing I would say here is that in February, the Prime Minister's Closing the Gap speech re-anchored the process of the design of the Voice to Parliament and constitutional recognition back to the Joint Select Committee's report, so the Joint Select Parliamentary Committee's report led by Dodson and Lisa. In that report, they state that the only viable option on the table is a voice to Parliament. And while they lament the fact that symbolism has been rejected, they accept that Uluru rejected symbolism. So one of the important parts of Scott Morrison's speech was just to reorient the whole debate back to that report. And he has said that once this design phase is over, we will look to the legal form. And so this is really, I think, where we are this year is we need to make good the argument for constitutional enshrinement as opposed to legislating a voice. And I really think that's where we are this year. That voice committee led by Ken Wyatt is doing its work currently. It presumably will be delayed like most because of the coronavirus. Certainly insofar as consultations with our communities, they won't be able to go out to communities until there's a virus or at least some understanding of where we go in a post-COVID environment. And of course, there's the economic imperative, as you refer to. So really, I think we are just in that space of continuing to engage the Australian people on really what is the battleground, that is constitutional enshrinement or legislation in terms of the voice. In terms of symbolic recognition in the Constitution, I can't see how that will ever be able to run on its own as a question unless you have substantial numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people opposing it and voting no. I think in a recognition exercise, you know, there's two parties. The state or the Australian people have to agree, but so do the to be recognised. We have a say in this, and we have said no to a symbolic, you know, statement in the Constitution, or any minimal change for that matter, is what the dialogue said. So, so I don't think there'll be a referendum, a symbolic referendum, and I think we just wait out the year because of this kind of unexpected pandemic. But despite, you know, I saw Stan Grant's piece in the conversation, there's a lot of people that have just, you know, taken Malcolm Turnbull's word in 2017 and decided this is dead. It is far from dead. And I think when people say that, they strip agency from the Australian people, you know, from the unions to the corporate sector, to, you know, CWA and community groups, to our own mob. We've had a huge number of people endorse and come on board, and I think that support is there. It's just, you know, rarely spoken about in the kind of public domain.
Great, thank you. That was terrific, Megan. I might. It's lovely to hear your ideas, and lovely also to hear your account that this is a long way from being dead in the water. So I'll hand over to you, Stephen, to facilitate some discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi, and thanks so much, Megan. There's a couple of questions that have come through, and just on my part, I was struck by your statement that historians need to step up to the plate, and but not in the way that we might think historians need to step up to the plate. I mean, I'm very supportive of that, and doing the job that historians do, doing history. But what you're saying is actually we should be more involved in the legal reform process, which I think is a really important thing. And it's possibly something that I think we should take back to the History Council and discuss. Maybe there's a role there for us as well.
Yeah, sorry.
Go on.
Oh, no, I just think, I think, so when I say, I mean, I don't necessarily mean, you know, placards and hitting the streets, but certainly in terms of law reform and change, the narrative in the story that you tell about the impetus for change is really critical. And I think there's and when I say a lot of work, I think at least what I heard in the dialogues is that a lot of mob feel that there's, you know, some work to be done between historians and our people on formulating that argument for change. Law reform is such a difficult thing to do, and certainly when you couch it in that way, I've seen a lot of historians feel very uncomfortable about the notion of, you know, I suppose this sounds a bit strange, right? Becoming involved in the political, or becoming involved in a constitutional kind of process, but my view is there is a natural role here, because you're talking about what so many have alluded to, and that is the story. The development of the nation is predicated upon the dispossession, and it's historians who tell that story.
That's a great point, and that's what Kira kind of hopefully answers Kira's question about decolonising Australian history. James Blackwell has asked, how do you, Megan, combat the false perception from those like Malcolm Turnbull and many others in the government that the Uluru Statement is both a third chamber to Parliament and that it's unachievable? I think you touched on this, but maybe you could briefly go back to it.
Yeah, no, yeah, Malcolm Turnbull is a little frustrating this year because he's got his memoirs out and it's like, didn't you go in 2017 and you're back again? Well, look, the third chamber was just mischievous. There's nothing about the proposal that makes it a third chamber. It's just simply not possible for there to be a third chamber. And certainly nothing set out by the Referendum Council would give any suggestion that it was. And I know that Barnaby Joyce has apologised for coming up with that. I guess what Malcolm Turnbull is alluding to is that having a voice would provide some accountability to the Parliament about the decisions that they make when it comes to Aboriginal communities. And so I think as a politician, you always feel nervous, right? They feel nervous about a corruption commission. They feel nervous about a Bill of Rights. So they feel nervous about a voice to Parliament, because Australia has got one of the most famously kind of unconstrained parliaments in the world, where they feel like our form of extreme sovereignty, where they're accountable to very few institutions and very few people, except the people, every couple of years. I think he was alluding more to that. Expressions like the third chamber are simply meant to kill reforms, and that was his intention. It is a voice to Parliament. It sits outside of Parliament. It provides advice to Parliament. Its structure is a First Nations structure where we can go back to communities and go, get on the ground and ask people who are actually impacted by a particular proposal for a law or policy, the ways in which it might impact them, or the ways in which it can be designed better. There is nothing about the model or any of the design features of it that are a voice that is actually in the Parliament. So I think, James, it's just a matter of continually talking about what the voice is. And certainly I think the third chamber, mischief is why they've felt it's needed to design what a voice might look like first, before Australians vote on what a voice is.
Yeah, thanks. Kira Lindsay has another question. She was taken with Wesley Enoch's statement at the Big Thinking in November last year about the need for non-Indigenous Australians to develop the curiosity and passion to get involved and accept the fact that one must get it right. And she asks both Heidi and Megan, do you have some suggestions about the sorts of models, protocols, processes that we can develop, already work with when it comes to collaboration in rewriting our histories? To give us a project or some projects, and it kind of actually ties in a little bit with a question that I wanted to ask, which was not just about historians, but about some of the organisations, the members of the History Council, history organisations. So I'm not just talking about historians, but maybe history groups as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think different groups, and there are different kind of local historian groups and other groups that are doing this work around the country. I'm reflecting on some of the work that's been done in Far North Queensland between, mobs that used to be, white mob and Aboriginal mob that used to be on the other side of the argument when it came to the Native Title Act, who are now on the same side in terms of Uluru, but partly because they're on the same side in terms of fracking, and they successfully stopped fracking. My point is, when groups come together, they necessarily determine, what is the best way of working together. When we started the dialogue process, we ran a series of leadership meetings across the country to ask traditional owners and to ask peak bodies and to ask Aboriginal leaders the ways in which we need to run the dialogues. How do we go out and talk to mob? What can't we say? And so that work's really, really critical. But I can only talk about it vaguely, because of course you can't talk about it in the abstract, but I'm not sure if that is entirely answering the question. Heidi, did you?
Well, one thing I'd add is that I've been working with AATSIS on a research project that's looking at the possibility of a national resting place, and a national resting place that could be in Canberra, could be centrally located in the Parliamentary Triangle and so forth. Could be a national resting place is needed in whatever form it takes in order to be a site for the tens of thousands of Aboriginal bodies that were taken overseas to continental Europe and to the UK and North America, and also in scientific medical institutions in Australia and museums. And I think the repatriation of ancestral remains is one really significant development that has been a part of the sort of work of the Aboriginal Centre, for instance, from the 1970s. And it's now really quite has comprehension on the part of governments across the globe that it is not right to have ancestral remains of Indigenous peoples held in those institutions. And I think that just the national resting place is one example of what a site might look like that embodies truth-telling about the past, embodies the possibility of remembering and restoring dignity, so restorative justice. So I feel very optimistic about those sort of developments and what they might mean in terms of advancing truth-telling and advancing a different narratives. It could be a site where school kids visit. Yes, I think there are some good some really interesting initiatives, and in fact that the National Resting Place did get a mention in the final response to the Referendum Council report.
Yeah.
So there's those sort of initiatives sort of developing in different ways that I think really will make a significant what would you say? I think they'll make a mark on the way we think about the nation and how people can relate to the past.
Yeah, I think I totally agree, Heidi. That's a fantastic point. It's sometimes those symbolic elements, such as what I find is the amazing thing about the statement from the heart. It's symbolic elements that are critical.
And I think that's the critical thing about the statement still being with us. I mean, that statement, we have every intention, it is the subject of an agreement with the Mutijulu Aboriginal Corporation and community. They are the ones that hosted Uluru, and they are the ones who will hold the painting, and we're hoping will be a new dwelling or building in that area where they can maintain the Uluru handback documents and the closure of the rock documents and the Uluru painting, so that this painting becomes a part of that story of Australian democracy, so that when kids go to primary school and high school and they do those trips to Canberra that they do, that one would hope that Uluru would be included in that trip if you want to understand that story of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and Australian democracy.
Well, thanks so much, Megan and Heidi. That's all we have time for. We look forward to seeing you at our next History Effect event. I hear a rumour it might be on the 1919 Spanish flu. We hope the History Effect series will be an ongoing series and reach out to a lot of the work from home bound audiences, and well beyond that after these pandemic times, and we'll hopefully end soon. So thank you very much everyone for coming.